If there were any unanswered questions, we can give you an email and then post that to the website as a resource, so everybody makes sure to get what they need in. So we can do that as well. Thank you all so much. That was absolute fabulous information. Lisa.
I'm here. You got me?
Yes, I do. I should have you upgraded to co-host, so you should have the ability to share your screen.
All right. Should I share that now or just wait?
Whatever you want. If you want to go ahead and get it up, that's fine. And we'll get started here in about 3 minutes.
All right. Okay. It's ready.
Yep, that looks great.
Okay, we are at 10:10, so to keep these rolling along, because it looks like most of us have some great questions, we're going to start on our next session, and our moderator is Deb, and the topic is food safety. So I will send it over to Deb.
Thank you. We're really excited to again have Lisa Harrison, who is with the Food Protection Division at the Indiana State Department of Health. This is always one of the most popular sessions for the forum, and Lisa does a great job with her presentation. So I know she's got a lot to cover. So Lisa, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Deb, for that. Yes, I'm from the State Department of Health, and so I'm going to just be kind of talking today. You can follow along the slides about just kind of basics of food safety. But one of the big things toward, after I get through about 4 or 5 slides, we'll be kind of switching over to mostly home-based vendors at the farmers market, because that is typically the most popular topic that we discuss during the event. So with that, we'll just go ahead and get started, and we'll hopefully have time at the end to answer some questions. And if we don't get to the question, I'll have my contact information at the bottom or at the very last slide. Feel free to send me any emails that you have about any questions that you have. So, well, let's see here. Trying to advance. Maybe. There we go. All right. So just a quick little piece here. So the State Department of Health, as of September 2020, our name has changed and we are now the Department of Health. So throughout the slides, you'll see IDOH instead of ISDH. And so this presentation kind of reflects that change. All right, so definition here of farmers market, which you're all going to be involved in. It's a common facility where 2 or more farmers, growers gather on a regular basis to sell fruits and vegetables and other farm products directly to the consumer. This can be simultaneous with other events, but particularly, usually it is a reoccurring event, as most of you are aware, and you do this every weekend. There are summer markets, winter markets, but in order for you to be called a market, you got to meet the basic definition first. Now, at the farmers market, there are all kinds of vendors, and I know in the past there's been a lot of market masters that have listened into this, trying to determine what kind of folks they should have coming out to the market. And of course, home-based vendors, this is one of the main sources the home-based vendors can sell as at a home or at a farmer's market, as well as a roadside stand. But we're going to focus this on the farmer's market. This won't be an exhaustive talk about anything food safety, and it won't be an exhaustive talk about farmers or home-based vendors. So this will be just related to the farmers market. So farmers markets, definitely a big one that attends. Home-based vendors are big ones that attend the farmers market. You may have some people that are selling pre-packaged, non-potentially hazardous food. So you may have someone that's just doing, maybe candy bars, bags of chips, cans of soda, things that are not potentially hazardous foods, and they don't require a permit for them to sell those things as long as no sampling or open products are concerned. You may have whole and cut produce. Obviously, those are big parts of the farmers market. You may have some farmers markets that want to invite retail food establishments. So those can be food trucks. They can be booths set up to make food on site. Those particular entities would be regulated by the local health department. Some of them may be like restaurants who bring food or something like that. But the bottom line for them is they are regulated entities. The health department will give them a food permit, and the health department, when available, will do an inspection of that facility while they're at the farmers market. You may have nonprofit organizations, churches, Girl Scouts, the sports clubs, civic groups. Those particular groups can be there to sell food items. You may have some wholesalers who actually, at a normal time, they're selling their items to grocery stores and items like that, but they may come to the farmers market to sell their items as a retail type of a setting. And then you also could have some holders of a winery brewery permit. I think in the last presentation, I heard a couple of questions at the end about that. So it is possible to have those folks there as well. And they are regulated by alcohol and tobacco under IC 7-1. And definitely, if there are more questions about that, you can definitely talk to me about that, but you can also talk to Alcohol and Tobacco Commission as well. All right, so this is talking about kind of our retail food items. Even though all the other groups are going to be there, food safety is a concern no matter who you are. So the thing about the retail food, though, is they will be regulated on that at the farmers market, whereas some other ones, it is something they're supposed to be doing some food safety types of things while they're there, but they aren't necessarily regulated when they do it. So some of the things that the retail folks will have to think about that you invite to the farmers market is they're all going to have a permit. Local health departments set their own ordinances. And remember, this is not the home-based vendor. This is the people that are regulated. So the health department sets their own ordinances and their own fees that they're going to charge. So in every county that a retail establishment, retail vendor, mobile food truck goes to, they would need to have a permit from that local health department. And each health department does it a little bit differently. So you would have to kind of have that relationship with your local health department to know what you're going to be charged. And if you go into another county, what's expected of you. Temporary permits are usually required in every county. So just remember that when you're going different locations. All the food that is served in a retail setting, so those mobiles, those temporary food establishments, all of that food has to be from an approved source, and you can't have any food that is cooked from the home. So all that stuff needs to either be done on site or at a commercial kitchen that's inspected by a local health department. And then when the health department comes to the farmers market and does inspections on those booths, then they would inspect those food products that are there to make sure they're from an approved source. Temporary booths or temporary units like that have a tent outside, it has to be constructed of a suitable material. It has to be smooth and easily cleanable. So if you have tables or counters, you want to make sure there's no breaks in it or cracks or dents. Bacteria can get into those things and cause problems later on. You want to have a floor. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to build up a floor, but you want to have something down. That way you're not kicking up dirt and dust if you're on rocks or concrete or even grass. If it rains or something like that, you'll get dust kick up, and that actually goes up and can get on all the food items. So it's a good idea to put something down so that you have a floor that you can stand on. So that could be a mat or something like that. You want to try to have overhead protection, of course, unless you're inside of a barn or something like that. But the overhead protection is helpful to keep from things flying over the top of you, dropping what they may. So overhead protection is a good idea. And it also helps with keeping things at a good regular temperature, because those summer markets in particular, it gets really, really hot. And so some kind of covering will help kind of ease that pressure of the sun shining right down on your head and your products. If it happens to be nighttime, you want to have adequate lighting so you can see what's going on. And then always think ahead and think about how you can provide as best protection as possible from insects. They're there, you're outside, it's okay, but try to best keep that from happening. And then how you can take care of things in bad weather. So when it rains, I don't know necessarily when it snows, like right now. I know we're all waiting for snow to move in. Some of you may be snowing right now, but you just never know what the weather is going to bring. Wind is another one, particularly in summer markets. So you want to think about those things and what kind of things are blowing through as you're sitting there. All right, water and plumbing is always very important. If the market master is not going to be providing an area for people to get water, which you definitely could provide some place for people to get potable water, but if not, that means people are bringing potable water from another location. So you just have to make sure that it's potable water, that we can drink it, we can use it to wash our hands, but if we have a hose hooked up to it, that we have backflow prevention. And people who do normally retail food establishments, temporary food establishments, are usually very aware of this type of thing already, and the local health department will ask these questions when they get there. But potable water is the big thing that we want to think about, as well as where we're going to dump our wastewater. So that would be something that market masters, you want to think about what kind of your plan is for wastewater. We don't want to dump that on the ground. So you can, provide a place for them for dumping, or they can know ahead of time that they'll have to take that stuff back from where they came from and dump waste at that location. Food establishments that are regulated, they need to make sure that they have good, adequate space for dry storage, cold storage, so coolers, refrigerators. It depends on what they want to bring in if they have electricity outlet, but those regulated items that require cold storage, they want to make sure they have a place to be able to keep things cold in their booth. They want to make sure that they have proper temperature measuring devices, that they're able to have plenty of room for food preparation and food storage, as well as warewashing. If they plan on warewashing at the site, then they would need to have warewashing facilities. If not, they can take them back to their location where they are housed at, and they can do warewashing there. It's just not the home. It's not the home address for regulated vendors. So you want to make sure that they're aware of that. Hand washing is a must. It doesn't matter what type of vendor you are. Hand washing is a must. It's the single most important way that we can prevent foodborne illness, simply by washing our hands. And so this little get up right here is kind of a temporary setup. It's one example of a temporary setup. If you're in a food truck, if you're a mobile person in a food truck and you're permitted through the local health department, you probably already have, or you should have, hand washing facilities inside that truck. But if you're sitting outside at an event, then this is a good example of what you would need for a hand washing station. So that wastewater bucket underneath, and then, like I said, we're going to have some place to be able to dump that water when we're done. Some kind of, cooler or urn that you can put warm water on, soap, paper towels, and some place to throw those paper towels. It's real easy to do, and everybody definitely can wash their hands. And that's, like I said, a requirement for whoever is doing any open exposed food. All right, so with that being said, those are just some basic things that market masters can think about, basic things that people are going to be doing regulated food items for them to think about what they need to do. So these next slides really are going to pertain pretty much to home-based vendors and home-based vendors only. So it's going to give some explanation of what a home-based vendor is. And like I said earlier, it's not exhaustive. It's only pieces of a normal slide that I give just to kind of give you a picture of it, but it may not be the full picture. So questions are always welcome to make sure that we're doing the right thing. Let's start with that. So definition of home-based vendor. I have gotten more calls this past year about home-based vendors than I think just about any other questions. So that means that home-based vendors are really starting to ramp up, and we're getting lots and lots of them. And that's great. It's a great avenue for people to start a business and to kind of get their foot wet in selling food items. And so we're really happy to help with those types of things. So in order for you to be a home-based vendor, you're an individual who has made, grown, or raised a food product in their primary residence or property owned or leased by them, that you're selling that food product they made or grown or raised at a roadside stand or a farmer's market. Poultry, rabbit, and eggs may be sold from the farm. So any kind of home-based vendor product that's approved, and we'll talk about those things that you can and cannot do, but they can be sold at farmers markets and roadside stands only. The law does allow for poultry, rabbit, and eggs to be sold from the farm, and there's some delivery aspect with those products. They have to comply with 1642-529. That's what we kind of lovingly call the home-based vendor law. So that means that if you want to be a home-based vendor, then you're going to have to comply with the items in that particular law. And we're going to go through most of those things today. So one of the things a home-based vendor can't do is to sell potentially hazardous food items unless they're identified in law. So the example of a potentially hazardous food item that is allowed would be poultry, rabbit, eggs. Those are potentially hazardous food items, but they can sell those under restrictions as a home-based vendor. All other products cannot be a potentially hazardous food product. So when we say potentially hazardous food product, instead of kind of going through this whole type of a thing here and reading all of these words, it pretty much is anything that will allow for the growth of harmful bacteria or bacteria that causes foodborne illness. So particularly Clostridium botulinum is the thing of concern when we're talking about canning or reduced oxygen packaging. And so we look at values of food items to make sure that they're not potentially hazardous, like pH and water activity. Those two items at correct levels will not allow for the growth of bacteria, that harmful bacteria that can cause people to get sick. Now, there are other items that people cannot sell because they intrinsically are potentially hazardous food. So like we said, meat, dairy, you would not be able to sell those items. Cut melons would be another thing that you cannot sell because it intrinsically is a potentially hazardous food item. Cooked produce, garlic and oil mixtures, those things, garlic and oil particularly, if not modified, those things are potentially hazardous foods. And so we would not be allowed to do those things as a home-based vendor. The other thing about a home-based vendor is a home-based vendor has to sell to the end consumer. So that means if I'm the vendor, I'm selling to the person that's going to eat my food, the end consumer, and that consumer can't sell it to anyone else. They're the ones that are going to eat it. So that end consumer is the key thing. We talked about this a little bit before, examples of potentially hazardous food: meat, poultry, aquatic animals and products, dairy, egg products, excluding, some baked items like a dried egg noodle. Even though there are eggs in that, once you dry that out, you don't provide enough water activity for bacteria to grow. So that can be allowed. So baked items have eggs in them. Some baked items have some dairy items in them. It depends on the end product. The end product cannot be a potentially hazardous product. So even though you may use potentially hazardous things to make it in the beginning, at the end, it can't be a potentially hazardous product. All right, so some other examples of potentially hazardous food: reduced oxygen packaging. So when we are sealing containers and removing oxygen or changing how the oxygen is present in that container, that would be a reduced oxygen packaging method. Canning or hermetically sealed containers of acidified or low acid foods. Those cannot be sealed in containers. So that would be like your green beans, potatoes, things like that. Those are low acid foods. And so you cannot seal those in a jar and sell those at a farmer's market. No canned foods. Cut melons, raw seed sprouts, those things also potentially hazardous. No jerky. Jerkies, I know, is dried out meat, but that is actually a very high risk type of activity. And a lot of components need to go into making jerky. So when we see it out on our shelves in the grocery stores, those have been made under some pretty strict conditions when they make them, so that you don't have a risk of that product absorbing water again through the air and the atmosphere and causing problems later on. Non-modified garlic and oil mixtures. So, just dipping that garlic into that oil, that is a huge possibility for Clostridium botulinum, because that oil acts as a kind of a trap, and it traps that in there and no oxygen can get into that product. So that's why that is a bad one. Cut leafy greens and tomatoes. We're going to talk about cut leafy greens and tomatoes here in just a minute on another slide. But in essence, you can't have cut leafy greens and tomatoes unless you're doing something to it to make it a non-potentially hazardous food. So FDA has said that cut tomatoes and cut leafy greens now are considered potentially hazardous foods. So you couldn't make salads, like a salad mixture or something like that, put it in a bag, because those things require refrigeration. And as such, they're potentially hazardous and could not be sold by a home-based vendor. But like I said, hold on to cut tomatoes and leafy greens, because we will talk about them in a minute related to salsa. All right, so these are examples of home-based vendor products. These are things that you can do with no issues typically at the farmer's market. So baked goods, cakes, fruit pies. And when we're talking fruit pies, we're talking high acid fruit. So that would be things like apples and cherries and peaches and things like that that are high acid. You want to be careful. You will not be able to do things like pumpkin, sugar cream pies, because those things have a lower pH, and so we cannot guarantee the safety of those things. But a high acid fruit in sugar, which you make in a fruit pie, those are just fine to make. Dry egg noodles are just fine. You can make candy and confections, caramels, chocolates, fudge, all that good stuff. Whole uncut produce, tree nuts and legumes. Now, we get questions about this sometimes because one of the things that you cannot do as a home-based vendor is you can't buy a bunch, like let's say peanuts. You're going to buy a giant bag of peanuts, which peanuts don't really grow a lot in Indiana, but you're going to buy a big bag of them and just kind of divide them up and put them in a different container. In order for you to do that, you got to do something to the peanuts. So you can roast them. If you roast them, you've taken something that started out from an original and you've made it into something else. You've made that into something else. Coffee is another thing that, we don't grow coffee in Indiana typically. So you can buy coffee beans and then roast them and grind them. And then that can be your home-based vendor business, because you're taking something that you did not make, but you're making it into something that you did make. So that'd be fine. So tree nuts, legumes are okay. Honey, molasses, sorghum, maple syrup, all those are fine. Jams, jellies, and preserves. And once again, high acid fruit and sugar. Jams, jellies, and preserves that are high acid fruit and sugar can be sealed in jars, but anything that is not a high acid fruit cannot be sealed in a jar. So an example of a low acid fruit would be like a banana jam. I actually had somebody ask me about that yesterday. So a banana jam would not be something that you could do in a jar. Now you could make that, but you can't seal it in the container, because when you seal that in the container, because it's not a high acid fruit and sugar, the Clostridium botulinum is a possibility with that action. So high acid fruit and sugar, sealed in jars, no problems. Apple, grape, strawberry, those types of things are all high acid fruits. The berries, blueberry, raspberry, blackberry, jellies, those can be, because you don't have to add additional acid to them. It's just high acid and sugar. The sugar-free ones, you can't do sugar-free and seal it in a jar, because part of it is the water activity and the pH. And if you're taking away sugar, then that pH will be affected, or that water activity will be affected by that. You can use temperature control only for quality. So if I have chocolate chip cookies on a really hot day in August, and I don't want my chocolate chips to melt or my piece of fudge to melt, I can put it in the refrigerator to maintain the quality. What I can't do is use the refrigerator as a method of food safety. So if I were to make something like, like cooked vegetables, or maybe I'm going to make a lasagna, I couldn't do that at the farmer's market. I couldn't do that as a home-based vendor, because that lasagna requires refrigeration. So that's how come I can't do that as a home-based vendor. I can only do things that don't require refrigeration as a method of food safety. So other examples of home-based vendor products are, of course, rabbit and poultry and in-shell chicken eggs, because those are explicitly expressed in the law. Wild mushrooms, you can do wild mushrooms. However, it is a risky product. You are allowed to do it, but we strongly, strongly recommend that you get those mushrooms identified by a mushroom expert before you sell them at the market, just to make sure that you haven't made a mistake about, maybe it's a false morel, or maybe it is one that causes kind of psychedelic types of things happening. So you want to make sure that your mushrooms are identified before you sell them at the market, just to be on the safe side. All right, so here's their little slide about cut leafy greens and tomatoes, particularly tomatoes, related to salsa. So part of the thing about making salsa is that you're going to add some kind of acid to it. So you're taking that tomato, in essence, that is considered a potentially hazardous food, and you're adding an acid to it. Now, in order for us to know for sure that it can sit on the counter without refrigeration, you have to add enough acid to it that the pH of the product goes below or 4.6 and below. So in order for you to do that, if you are a salsa producer, then you have to have a pH meter to test that product, a pH meter, and not the little papers that test pH. It's got to be an actual meter, calibrated pH meter, and you'll need to understand and know how to calibrate. If the health department comes along just to kind of check what you're doing to make sure that your products meet the standard of the home-based vendor law, you will have to show them the pH of that product while they're there. Now, you don't have to go to the health department and show it to them or anything like that. It's only if you're asked. If they want to see it, see what the pH is while you're there on site, then you'll need to show them that with your pH meter. The other thing about someone doing salsa is it cannot be put into sealed jars. Clostridium botulinum is still a hazard, and so we can't put it into sealed jars, but you can put it into a container that has an obvious route of oxygen. So if you can have a hole in it somewhere or something to show the oxygen is getting in and out of that container, then you can sell that at the farmer's market. Just make sure that you have that pH meter, that way, just in case the regulatory authority may want to see the pH of that product, you have that available to them and you should have no problem. All right, cannot be done as a home-based vendor. You cannot do heat-treated vegetables. You can't do fermented vegetables in sealed containers. So you can do fermented vegetables. That pH meter will come in handy for that as well. It just makes sure that the end product is not in a sealed container. So kimchi, cabbage, those types of things, as long as they're fermented, you can do them, just not in sealed containers. You can't do low acid or acidified foods that are canned. You can't do those. And you can't do any shell eggs that are not from domestic chickens. So quail, duck, those types of eggs actually have to be regulated by your local health department. So they can be at the farmer's market. That's not a problem with them being there. It's just that they can't be home-based vendors and sell them. So you would just need to go to your local health department. Your local health department will give you a permit. They'll come and do an inspection. Their inspection is just pretty much looking at how you're handling. They're not going to look at your nests or anything like that. It's just making sure those eggs get cleaned in a nice designated area and that they're put into refrigeration. So, but the health department will need to issue you a permit for you to sell those types of eggs. If it's shell eggs, then you're going to go through the egg board in order for you to do that. Or chicken eggs. All right. Home-based vendors and poultry. So poultry can be done raw poultry can be done at the farmer's market. And these are the little things that you need to think about when you're doing it. So you can do up to 1,000 birds and you're not considered a food establishment, and they can be sold to the end consumer at the farmer's market or roadside stand or from the farm. If you do over 1,000 birds, you have to contact the meat and poultry division of the Board of Animal Health, and they will help you. They'll give you what you need to be able to do that if you're over 1,000 birds. If you want to sell your birds to a retail food establishment, so this is the only group that gets to sell to a retail food establishment. If you want to do that, you have eggs and you want to sell your chickens to a local restaurant, retail food establishment, if you sell 1 to 20,000 birds for that purpose, you have to get a limited permit from the Board of Animal Health. And they can help you with that and answer any of those questions that are related to poultry. So if you're thinking about poultry as a home-based vendor, definitely give them a call. Poultry, all the poultry that is produced and sold at the farmer's market or the roadside stand has to be frozen at those locations. If they sell it from the farm, it can be refrigerated at the point of sale or frozen, but at least refrigerated at the point of sale. Rabbits, it's very similar. So rabbits can be slaughtered and processed on the farm. There is no limit to how many rabbits you can do. So they can be sold at farmers markets, they can be sold at roadside stands, and you can pick them up directly from the farm. The ones that go to the farmers market or roadside stand, those have to be frozen. But from the farm, they have to be at least refrigerated at the point of sale, and they can only sell to the end consumer. So they are not allowed to sell to the restaurants. Only poultry can do that. All right, labeling is another really important component of home-based vendors. Home-based vendors have to have appropriate labeling, and it's listed here. So it is the producer's name and address, the common or usual name of that product, whatever you call it. If it's chocolate fudge and you call it Grandpa's fudge, that's your common name for that fudge. The ingredients of that product should be listed. It has to be from the greatest to the least. So if you think about a chocolate chip cookie, flour might be the biggest thing that you put in that chocolate chip cookie. So that should probably be listed first. You need to have the net weight or the volume or a numerical count on the packaging. So if you have a dozen cookies, then you would need to put 12 cookies. If it's something that's more of a liquid form, we would probably want to put a volume. You can put a weight. So just think about that. That would need to go on there. The date the food product was processed. And then we also want to put this statement, 10-point type, that this is a home-based product process and the production area has not been inspected by the Department of Health. So you want to make sure that you have that little statement on every packaged product. Now, if the event that you sell things individually, so if you're not selling in a package, but you're selling it individually, like an individual cookie, if somebody wants to walk past, they want to buy a brownie, they want to buy a cookie, that's just there at the time for them to buy it and eat it, and it's not in a packaged form, you can have a placard sitting up beside it for all of those things. But the one thing that we can't do is if you have a small package, sometimes it's hard to get all of those things on there, or it may interfere with the decorativeness. We're not worried about that. If it's packaged, you got to have those labels on there for people. That way they know that it's not a regulated food product. But any other time, if it's something that's not packaged, then you can have a placard to the side. All right. Whoops. All right. So there are some exceptions to the labeling. Most of the home-based vendor products are going to fall under that, with the exception of poultry. Poultry has their own labeling, and then so do the egg board. Any kind of labeling that you have with the eggs, that's going to be all through the egg board, and they have their own way that they would want you to do that. As far as the poultry, it depends on what kind of exemption that you have. The labeling, the main labeling will be that first statement there, the name, address, producer, name, pretty much what we had talked about in the previous slide. But if you have exemptions based on the permits that they give to you, then you would have the additional information on that label related to that permit from BOA. All right, samples. So home-based vendors can sample their products. With COVID right now, though, you would want to follow what it is the market master and that county wants you to do in relation to COVID. Okay, so all of this is, COVID, you never know what is going to happen with that. So if because of COVID, a health department or the market master says we will do no sampling, then you would have to abide by that. But under normal circumstances, if we weren't in a COVID pandemic right now, you could sample the products with no issue. The only thing is that sampling is sampling something individually, not combining two or more products. So an example, I grow strawberries and I also make little shortcakes. I cannot combine them and sell a strawberry shortcake. I can give a sample of strawberries, I can give a sample of my shortcake, but I can't combine them because those activities are retail types activities that require hand washing and all kinds of other things. And so we definitely want you to sample that product, but just be aware it's just going to be that sample. So a sample of sorghum, a sample of maple syrup, a little bite of a cookie, something like that. Sampling has to be discontinued if it's not done in a sanitary manner. So when the health departments kind of walk around and look at the events, they'll notice these types of things. And so you have to sample in a sanitary manner. So that would include hand washing, making sure that your containers are clean and sanitized, and you probably will be doing that from your home location. Make sure your stuff is protected when you take it to the market. If it's raining outside or it's a very windy day, you may have to secure that packaging or secure those items so that they aren't getting wet and splashed and all those types of things. And then protection from other sources of contamination. Additional points for home-based vendors. Home-based vendors, if you are a home-based vendor, you cannot sell other commercially prepared products. So no other prepackaged products. So an example of that might be that I make my own chocolate chip cookies and brownies, but I also want to sell cans of soda. So that would be an example of two things mixed together. If you're a home-based vendor, you got to stick with home-based vendor. Home-based vendors cannot deliver to any other location unless prescribed by the law. So that would be our poultry we talked about, rabbit, eggs. They can deliver those items. You can do pre-ordering. So you can pre-order off of, the internet. You can take phone calls to pre-order where people will come to the market and pick up your products. That's fantastic. That face-to-face interaction is what we're looking for. That way people can ask you questions about your product since it's an unregulated product, and you're able to give them all the information that they need about that particular product. You can't sell in another state unless you meet the standards of their market. So that's kind of a given, I think. And it's the same thing if people come into our state, they have to meet our standard for a home-based vendor. So if you want to go to another state, your products would be okay if their home-based vendor or cottage laws allow for that. But that's something you would have to talk about with that state. All right, so home-based vendors are subject to inspection or lab samples if the HBV, the home-based vendor, is not compliant with the law. So maybe improper labeling, improper sanitation, things like that. Or the home-based vendor's product is misbranded or could be adulterated in some way. Then the health department can inspect and take samples of the product. If they receive a consumer complaint, if someone complains about the product or says something about the product and they report that to a local health department, the state department of health, we can come kind of and inspect what the process is. Or if there's an imminent health hazard. So maybe somebody complains that there's glass in something or something like that. So that could be an imminent health hazard that the health department may be coming out to your place of business to be able to do an inspection. All right, so the reasons why the regulatory authority will be at the farmer's market is because, one, they're probably inspecting regular retail food establishments. So those mobile food trucks, those booths that are set up selling hamburgers and hot dogs and those types of things. And they're also looking at just general sanitary conditions of the market. They're also ensuring at that time that home-based vendor products are what they are supposed to be. So no potentially hazardous products, that they're labeled and that things are sanitary and that they meet the requirements of the Section 29. And they're also there to educate. They educate the market masters and vendors and anybody who really has questions for them. That's one of the reasons why they're there as well. And I know around the state, lots and lots of market masters have great relationships with their health departments. And I would encourage you, if you're a new market master, to build that relationship with your health department, because they really are an advocate and a help for you in most cases. And you can always definitely call the State Department of Health and talk to me as well. We are very open to helping you with whatever that you need and to kind of give you some guidance on things. So feel free to give us a call. So just a review of home-based vendors. A home-based vendor will become a food establishment and they would be applicable to the food safety laws if they do any of the following. So they sell potentially hazardous food, except for poultry, rabbits, and eggs, or they sell products other than those that are not produced in their home. If they try to sell wholesale, which means they aren't selling to the end consumer, or if they fail to meet the requirements specified in 1642-529. But in most cases, everybody seems to be doing a very good job. So these are just some additional contacts for you that you can call if you have additional questions. And here's my information at the end. So I think that I kind of went through that fast enough that if there are any questions, I would love to hear them and to be able to help out with that.
All right, Lisa, we got plenty of questions. Are you ready?
Yes, let me get this slideshow off of here so I can kind of see here. All right.
All right. First and foremost, would you be willing to share those slides with us that we might be able to put those as a resource on the website?
Absolutely. And then
Great.
also remember too that slide presentation is kind of bits and pieces. There is a fuller home-based vendor slide that kind of talks about the law that I didn't talk about. So I can actually provide both things for you.
Great. We would appreciate that. All right. Hold on, let me scroll back up here. I thought I took good notes and maybe I didn't. Can you sell, as a home-based vendor, can you sell unprocessed grains?
Unprocessed greens. So Nihan, to help me out with that. So are we talking like microgreens, or are we talking like kale, those types of, kale, greens, that type of a thing? Yes. So microgreens, yes, microgreens can be sold at the farmer's market. The way we look at that when you chop that off that medium, that is a raw agricultural product. So you can sell that, or you can sell it on the trays. As far as greens like collard greens, kale, those types of things, yes, you can do whole produce that way. It's just that you're not going to do any processing. When we talk about cut leafy greens and tomatoes, we're talking about just chopping those things up. If it's one field cut, like if I have a head of lettuce, I cut it out of the field, that's fine. It's whole and intact. So same thing with a stalk of kale. I chop it off to bring it to the market. That's a field cut. And now I have a whole stalk of kale. And that can be sold at the farmer's market, but I can chop it up and put it into a salad.
We had an individual share a file, and it's a farmer's market permit application from Allen County Department of Health. And it says, doesn't this allow home vendors to sell hazardous foods? From what I'm looking like, it doesn't, it's just the permit. It just asks what they'll be selling, and it doesn't refer to any additional.
Okay. So I'm not quite sure what Allen County has. I'll write this down here. So
there is a link to it in the chat.
Okay. So some health departments have a farmer's market permit. Those permits are usually for the retail vendors who sell at the farmer's market. They're typically not for home-based vendors. It's just called a farmer's market permit. Home-based vendors are not required to have a permit, and they're not required to be charged for a permit. So definitely if you're from that county, just make sure that that's not talking about you, because they're not supposed to charge permit fee to a home-based vendor. Now, like I said, if you're, Bob's Taco Truck, come into the farmer's market and that's the only thing that you do, they could issue what they call a farmer's market permit. But that would be only for retail people. But definitely check with that county just to make sure. But there should be no permit fee related to a home-based vendor.
If an individual does grow peanuts in Indiana, can they sell them unroasted?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes, absolutely. It's just there's not a lot of growers of peanuts. Good for you. And make sure you advertise that, hey, I grew this myself right here in Indiana and not in Georgia or something like that. So yes, if you grow it yourself, you don't have to do nothing to it. But if you get them from like Georgia or something like that, and they come in already made, you didn't do anything to them. So in that case, you want to do something to them, roast them or something, make them into peanut butter. That way you're taking something else and you're making it, you're doing something with it.
Does the new rules on cut leafy greens apply to farmers as they harvest them?
Say that again.
Does the new rules on the cut leafy greens, does that apply to farmers as they harvest said leafy greens?
All right, so cut leafy greens is actually not new. Cut leafy greens has always been there. And it does not apply to a farmer that does the field cut. You know, that thing where you're just, like I said, you got heads of lettuce, you got spinach, and you're just chopping that first cut off. You're not doing any other product. You may rinse it off to make sure you get the big dirt off of it, but you're not processing it in any other way. And you're not chopping it up for, say, like a salad or something. You're just doing that field chop, and that is a raw agricultural product. And everybody's been doing that all over states, so they've been doing good with that.
All right. How about freezer beef sales? How are they classified?
Freezer beef sales are still considered a retail food establishment. So that means they have to be permitted by the local health department, and the local health department will actually come to their site. Now, granted, most of the time freezer beef, at least that I've seen, they have a designated area like in a garage or a shed where they may have a freezer. They go get the meat processed at an approved Board of Animal Health or USDA plant. They bring that meat back. It's in a freezer in a location, usually at their home. The health department will come out maybe every year just to make sure it's frozen, just to make sure that's plugged in and all that kind of stuff. When they go to the farmer's market, they do have to have a temporary food permit to do that. And that's just because the law only addressed poultry, rabbit, and eggs, and it did not address any kind of beef product.
You did answer this, but I want to make sure it's a big question. Can you use pressure cookers to kill botulism in jars?
Well, yes and no. Pressurizing them does in some cases break the cell membranes. However, as a home-based vendor, you cannot use a pressurized, you can't pressurize. I know when you can, people use pressure to can, and of course, there are benefits. There are reasons that we do that, but as a home-based vendor, you cannot do that because, just to let you know, the cans that you see on the shelves and the jars that you see on the shelves in the grocery store, that is a scheduled thing that FDA inspects. FDA requires that there's a process authority to approve that process. So canning food in a large amount is a very risky activity. And yes, through their preservatives, through pressurizing, and through different things, they don't necessarily kill it, but they prevent those spores from growing out in that process. Now, yes, pressurization does help with that. But as a home-based vendor, that is just a very risky product and not allowed to be done.
Can apple cider be done?
Apple cider can be done, yes, because it's a high-acid fruit. You want to make sure that you're being safe about it, because there are other problems with apple cider, but you would not be pasteurizing. It would be unpasteurized apple cider. But yes, you can do that. You would have your label on there that talks about that it's not a regulated product, and you wouldn't want to seal it in a container.
We had a few questions about mushrooms that Miranda Edge, because she sells them, got to. But yes, homegrown mushrooms are allowed. And there is a society in Indiana that does get those mushroom experts. They can help get those identified.
Yes, and if anybody out needs a mushroom identifier, they can get on our website, and we have a list of mushroom identifiers. That is a strong recommendation.
Awesome, good to know. Are we only concerned about cut tomatoes and leafy greens, or does that rule include all cut produce?
So cut melons, you can't do cut melons, right? Because that's potentially hazardous food. Yes, it is only cut tomatoes, cut leafy greens that are potentially hazardous, but you can cut up you can cut up apples, you can cut up other types of things. Yes, you can cut them up. You can't cook them, because you can't have any cooked vegetables, but they're cutting up produce a lot and all the other things that you do. But tomatoes and leafy greens are considered potentially hazardous unless acidified in relation to like making a salsa.
So kind of also on this topic there, I'm a grower of romaine lettuce, and I have other greens and herbs. I might trim those, peel those to fit in a certain plastic container that I sell. Is that incorporated under that greens and tomato cut rule?
Yeah, no cutting of them except that field cut. And you can do a little bit of washing and processing, you know, that not processing, but washing them if you got a bunch of big clumps of dirt or something. That actually has been a question that I've been asked a lot, like what is the, you know, the cutoff point of a cut? You have to remember that the reason why that they're saying, for one, lots of outbreaks have been associated with produce here in the last few years, particularly cut leafy greens. And so FDA has said that that is going to be considered a potentially hazardous food because it doesn't have a high pH on it. And so when you cut those edges, you open up that stalk for possible bacteria growth. So that's second, we're going to minimize it as much as possible. The other thing is when you think about a salad or something like that, those vegetables don't get cooked. And so whatever we're eating is what we're going to get. There's no kill step related to those.
We had a few questions regarding, can we see example of an oxygenating container? What's the definition of a sealed container? Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, so the best way to think about it is if you cannot get an obvious route of oxygen. So if you have a bottle of water sitting in front of you, I don't, but if I did, a bottle of water, when you put that lid on there, it's pretty sealed. Oxygen can't get inside of it. It's sealed the way it is. So people have always asked about in relation to hermetic seals and stuff like that. What we want to look at is that we have to have oxygen to it. So that means that if I seal that container in any way that oxygen can't get into it, that's what we're talking about. We're not debating whether or not it's a hermetic seal or this or that or the other. It's if I can't get oxygen to it, then it's a sealed container. So you can poke holes in things. You can use, other types of coverings. People have been very creative. So just think about ways that you can get oxygen into that container. Obvious routes.
Can pumpkin jelly be sold in an unsealed container?
Pumpkin jelly can be sold in an unsealed container, provided you add enough acid to that. You're trying to make that pH 4.6 or below. You want to add sugar to it. So it can be done in an unsealed container.
Confirmation about dried herbs and or dried fruit tea blends. Are those eligible as an HBV?
Yes, herbs and teas, yes, those are fine. What you have a little bit more trouble is if you're wanting to dry vegetables. That is probably not going to be a good idea because that involves even though we're drying it, it still involves kind of a cooking process in that drying that it heats it up. So there's a part of a cooking process there. And so cooked vegetables would not be allowed. But yes, you can do herbs, you can do teas, because those are just in essence little leaves that we dry up.
Can you put the label online and then put a link to that label on the package?
No, it's got to be with the package, on the package. And so just real quick, the reason why you would want that is because there are people who have allergens and all kinds of different things that rely on that. And to have them go find a website that has it is probably a little counterintuitive and a little bit more liability on you to do that. So that's something that has to be on the product.
Kind of additionally on the same topic, due to COVID, almost all products eaten now are put into a single serving envelope thing of some kind. Do these require labeling?
If you have a display of cookies per se, and you have those little paper envelopes and somebody comes up to you and says, I want to buy a chocolate chip cookie, and you stick it in the envelope at that time and hand it to them, you can still do the placard. But if you're actually going to package a cookie and send it out that way and you're giving them a packaged cookie on site, it would need the label.
Back to leafy greens for a moment. I missed one.
That's all right.
I sell cut lettuce mixes in sealed bags. It has been rinsed with hydrogen peroxide water and then spun out. What pH should my salad be to be able to still sell at farmers markets?
That has nothing to do with pH in that scenario. That is an activity that you cannot do as a home-based vendor because it's cut leafy greens in a bag. It doesn't matter what you've used to clean it with or anything. That is that is a potentially hazardous food product and not allowed as a home-based vendor.
Couple
Now,
of
I want to say that when we say it's not a home-based vendor, that doesn't mean that you can't ever do these things. What it means is you can't do them as home-based vendors. You can do them as retail food establishments, wholesale food establishments, just not home-based vendors.
Sampling, when you include, can you include a chip to sample salsa, or do you have to give a small spoon?
Yeah, I know that sounds kind of odd. It would be, because you don't want to combine two things. That's kind of what we're talking about. I would maybe contact your local health department. Some counties may be okay with that, so I don't want to just say yes or no. Some counties may say, oh, well, yeah, that's all right. One chip with some salsa. So maybe if that's what you're wanting to do, contact your local health department and just see if that would be something that they would allow or not. But technically, it is one item.
When talking about the placard for individual items, I'm guessing it's okay if there's one brownie or two cookies in a package to kind of protect them from contamination. Think a grab and go instead of a large container with tongs.
Yeah. So if you have a display of brownies and display of cookies, yeah, you'd want a placard for each one of them. But yes, in the same little package, you can put a cookie and a brownie. That's no problem. Just as long as there's a placard there that tells what's the ingredients of all of them.
Difference between cottage laws and HBV. Some places use those interchangeably. Indiana defines that all out as home-based balls, but some places, I believe it's Illinois, still refers to their rules on this as cottage law. So that's interchangeable.
Yeah, so it just depends on the state. It's just Indiana has chosen not to use cottage law as a way to identify our vendors. We chose to use home-based vendor as the title. When you look up, in fact, if you look up on the internet, you can even look up Indiana cottage food laws. But that's because there are all kinds of people across the United States that are gathering information about these things. And so just know that in Indiana, everything is referred to as a home-based vendor.
What about unprocessed grains? I think we talked about greens earlier and it was meant to be grains. Unprocessed grains.
So, I don't know, like barley and wheat and those types of things. Okay. So if we grow them here, if the farmer grows them here and harvests them and does something, wants to sell a bag of a grain or a like cornmeal, something like that. That's his product, his or her product, their farm product, they can sell it. But if you get, like, let's say corn from another location that you did not grow, you could take that corn and make it into cornmeal. And that would be fine because you've taken one thing and made it into something else. So you can do that. Does that help?
Yeah, kind of on that same topic, there's an individual thinking of selling her gluten-free flour blend. I'll get through that. She grinds millet and sorghums and mix it with starches. That's okay, right?
Yes. Yep.
I also grow pineapples in a hydroponic system. Is selling cuts considered okay in plastic as it has a higher acidic level?
So are you wanting to, like, I don't know, is this person like wanting to make like a chop up pineapple, or are they wanting to sell a whole pineapple?
I have a lot of messages, so that might be one where we'll come back and I can see it and we'll make sure we get her answered.
I see that, both on the pineapples.
Yeah. Elderberry syrup, how is that legal? How should it be packaged?
All right. So elderberries are one of those berries that are not very acidic. So I know, okay, so there's a couple things about elderberry syrup. Elderberry syrup, a lot of people try to make a health claim with elderberry syrup. One thing home-based vendors cannot do is make a health claim. In fact, most people are not allowed to make a health claim unless approved by FDA. So that's the first thing. No health claims on elderberry syrup. Second, you can make elderberry syrup because the acidity is not as high as some of the other berry types of things that we normally think of. You can sell it. You can make a syrup, but you can't still it in a jar.
Can a home-based vendor have a canning factory can their products if it's FDA regulated?
not as a home-based vendor, and FDA would not regulate you as a home-based vendor. So that answer would be no. If you want to can your food, that is fantastic. There are a couple of options. You can go to a co-packer. Co-packer will do that on your behalf. Or if you're really serious about wanting to be a canner, you would need to go and find someone. You would have to go through Better Process Control School first thing. Purdue offers that. So you can go there and take that. It's a good class. I've taken it myself. You would have to get someone who is a process authority. So a lot of times those are from academia. Those are just professionals that want to be a process authority. They're the ones that go through your plan to make that. And they, in essence, put their name on the line that says, yes, what this person is doing is acceptable and will prevent the growth of harmful bacteria, particularly Clostridium botulinum. And then you would have to do that in a processing plant. So what that looks like depends on what you're doing, but it would be a processing plant. And FDA, that process would be scheduled. It's called scheduled with FDA, and they have to approve it. And then they would do the ones that do your inspections. So that is a, you can do it though, just not as an HBV.
All right, we're getting down to the nitty gritty. So the next ones could be pretty quick answers. So
Okay.
jams and jellies, those are okay under home-based vendors, but then it says something about cans. So can you go over how we can get around that?
Yes. So jams and jellies have a standard of identity as a high acid fruit in sugar. High acid fruit in sugar means that it will have the low enough pH, 4.6 or below. And because you add that sugar, your water activity is going to be below 0.85 as that standard of identity. So those things can be sealed in jars. They can be canned. That's usually in a bath, a water bath for jams and jellies, not in a pressure cooker. Doesn't matter, but those can be done and sealed. So can honey, sorghum, those things are sugar based and they can be sealed in jars. Anything that's not a high acid fruit cannot be sealed in a jar.
Freeze dried, acceptable?
Depending on what it is. If it's a vegetable, no, because it's a cooking type of a thing. If it's a fruit, yes, but not in sealed bags, not in sealed containers.
To Bridget's question, does the ingredient need to include ingredients? Like if you have butter, do you have to say it's cream and salt? No, just what you use in it, correct?
No, it has to have the exact ingredients. So if I make chocolate chip cookies, the chocolate chips can't just say chocolate chips. You have to put all the sub ingredients for chocolate chips. So all the sub ingredients.
I learned something today. Maddie had come back with both on the pineapples. So you had asked if she was trying to sell cut or
so if it's a whole pineapple, you're just going to do the field cut and bring it in. Yes, you can chop up pineapples and you can sell chopped pineapple because it's a high acid fruit. Just don't seal it in a jar, put it in like a deli container with a lid in it or a hole in it.
Couple of things on gluten-free. Is that an allergen claim, a health claim? Can we claim gluten-free on home-based vendor goods?
Yeah, I think you can put that it is gluten-free if you truly don't have any gluten in it. And you don't have any allergens in it, but just make sure that you are very aware of what allergens are. So sometimes we think we know what the allergens are, but FDA has a whole list of what they declare as allergens. So yes, you can do gluten-free types of items, and you can say that you're not making a health claim. You're just saying it doesn't have any gluten in it. And you want to make sure you put all those labels, ingredients on there, because when you say that there isn't any in there, you got to make sure there's none in there.
And doesn't that kind of with gluten-free, that has to be within a gluten-free facility, and that's probably really hard to do with a home-based vendor, correct?
Well, that is a very, very good point, that some people are, especially with allergens, some of them are very severe allergens. And yes, usually that claiming that you're not making any other things with gluten in there, at least in a manufactured facility. That's the way that works.
Yeah, I can't even use a cutting board with my sister-in-law. She's that much of a celiac.
There you go.
All right, last, canned fruit barbecue sauce. Can that be canned?
Cannot seal it in a jar. And so you have to think about what pH does. So fruits, you're adding pH that way. If you're adding vegetables to it, you're lowering pH to it. So it comes down to pH. But yes, you can make that. You just can't seal it in a jar.
All right, we have a few other clarifying questions. I'll get those to you in email and make sure that we get those back to those particular individuals and post those on the website, because we've already went 5 minutes over. I want to give everybody a quick break. But thank you, Lisa, with lots of comments in the chat about how this is one of the most beneficial talks they've sat through. Thank you so much for being an educator and working this through. And we appreciate that very much.
No problem. Give me all your questions. I'll be glad to help you out.
Before we break, Amanda, Lisa,
Yes.
the next session is about county health department cooperation. Is there any possibility that you have time to stay for that in case questions come up that you could clarify?
Oh, sure. I could do that.
All right, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, well, we'll see everybody back and we'll start the next session here in about 4 or 5 minutes. Lee, I already have you upgraded to